From ancient winter solstice celebration to that particular Coca-Cola commercial and to all Santa Claus. On this episode we'll be talking about what winter solstice actually is, what some of the ancient winter celebrations were, and how we got to Christmas and Santa Claus. So stick around and enjoy. Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode. Funky Monkey here. Today we will journey through the history of winter celebrations from across the ancient and medieval world. Hopefully this will give you all world builders out there some inspiration to come up with your own celebrations if you don't already have some, or enhance those that you already have. But this episode is not only for world builders, no. This video will hopefully give you enough knowledge to survive those family encounters during the winter holidays. This way, you might be able to circumvent those discussions about politics or religion or world order or conspiracy theories by perhaps even boring people to tears and making them just give up the conversation. Who knows, you might even rile up some spirits if you play it right, although I do not condone family feuds. By the way, how do you celebrate the winter solstice or in general the winter holidays? Leave a comment down below as I'm very curious. Oh, and another point, for all you world builders out there, do you have similar celebration in your world? What do people celebrate in the middle of winter or during the longest night of the year? Leave a comment below. I really want to swap some ideas. In my world, during the winter solstice, people from multiple parts of the world celebrate the Festival of Renewal, during which the gods of light, after a very long struggle against the gods of darkness, have regained enough strength to be reborn and lengthen the days once more and bring life to the world. So basically kind of the standard winter solstice celebration. Of course, throughout my world there are many areas with different customs, with different approaches to the winter solstice. Now, before we jump in the story about the real world, let me talk about the miniature I will be painting today. This is an Aasimar paladin / cleric. I generally don't make a difference between the two because even though clerics are usually depicted as wielding blunt weapons, that's not always the case. It is a lovely little miniature and I hope you enjoy the painting process. Before we start our discussion about winter solstice, let me tell you what my plans for this miniature are and then we'll jump in. So, I will start with an Abaddon black base and this time I will use white scar for the zenithal, recreating light from above. Once it is done, I will start painting in the larger areas such as the cloak and the armor. For the cloak, I will go for deep reds and fiery orange highlights. As for the armor, I will go with a solid dark silver, and for the wings, well, I think I'm going to make them sparkle. This is Kale, a cleric of life, and I want to highlight this through the color palette. Now that you know what my plans for this miniature are, let us go through the checklist. I have coffee in my mug, although this time I felt the need for it to come in a pint. And I have something to soothe the soul before the winter holidays. And unfortunately there is no tea today, and my lively assistants are somewhere around the house. I don't know where. They found very warm, comfy places and they are sleeping their whiskers off. How about you? Are you all warm and comfy? Perfect. Then I guess it's time for a story. I'm sure that most of us, if not all of us, and when I say us I mean humanity, are familiar through the power of marketing with Santa Claus. And through Santa Claus, most people have heard of Christmas, although I'm sure that most aren't familiar, nor do they care to get more familiar with the meaning behind Christmas. Although we will be talking about Christmas, I want to cover the celebrations that existed for thousands of years long before Santa Claus and Christmas. We have to first understand what the winter solstice is. The winter solstice is the longest night of the year, at least here in the northern hemisphere. After the winter equinox, the nights begin growing longer and longer until they reach the climax during the month of December on the 21st. During this longest night of the year, many people have believed, and some of them still believe, that the forces of darkness are at their peak strength. There was also the belief that the old sun has died and the new sun was born, and thus, after this night, the days start growing longer and longer anew. In order to usher in this new sun and the renewal of light and life, people celebrated in different manners. Some cultures brought sacrifices, others threw large parties, banquets. Others spent this period in prayer, while most actually engaged in small gift exchanges. By the way, the winter solstice falls on the 21st of June in the southern hemisphere. Now that we've covered what the winter solstice is, let us talk about the celebrations around it throughout history and across the world. We will first start with Saturnalia, an ancient Roman winter solstice celebration. For the Romans, the solstice celebration began on December 17th and ended on December 21st. The celebrations were meant to celebrate, of course, the ancient god Saturn. He was a god of time, abundance, dissolution, wealth, agriculture, liberation, renewal, and he also had some connections with the underworld. He was a very, very busy god. He was the equivalent of the Greek god Kronos and fathered almost all of the Roman pantheon. The festivities mainly revolved around bringing offerings and sacrifices to Saturn, revolved around gladiatorial fights, feasts, street performances, and gift exchanges. Also, by the way, the Temple of Saturn doubled as the Roman Aurarium, or the Roman Public Treasury, and the state archives. Okay. According to sources, the statue of Saturn had its feet wrapped in wool across the year because of its link to agriculture and animal husbandry. On the 17th of December, the wool would be removed as a sign of liberation. After sacrifices were brought in honor of this deity, the Senate would organize a lectisternium. Lectisternium was a part of the public banquet where the statue of the god would be placed on a very sumptuous sofa or couch, and it would, in essence, have a very active role in the public celebration. It would partake in the public feasts. Weird, but not the weirdest thing that the Romans did. On the 17th of December, all schools would be closed. Nobody would exercise, but this mostly refers to soldiers. The courtrooms would be closed, there would be no justice dispensed, no war could be declared, and in essence, nobody worked. On the 18th and 19th, public holidays would be declared, and everything would be shut down for people to celebrate with their family or in the streets. But in my personal opinion, I do think that the taberne, cupone, popine, and thermopolie would still be open because, well, people needed to grab a bite to eat or grab something to drink while celebrating. If you have no idea what I just said, make sure you check out my previous video on ancient fast food places. Link will be over there. During this celebration, those who were also quite well off and could afford so would sacrifice a pig or a suckling pig in honor of Saturn and the agricultural aspect of this deity. By the way, this kind of sacrifice has continued throughout the ages and has reached us with no modification, and at least here in Eastern Europe, people around the 20th start sacrificing pigs. It is a social gathering for some. Now, I mentioned sacrifices brought to Saturn. There are sources who mention that at one point in a very, very distant past, in a very barbaric and distant past, the Roman god Saturn demanded human sacrifices. But seeing how both Greeks and Romans were appalled at the thought of human sacrifices, they had to come up with workarounds. Sources from the 3rd century CE tell us that Saturn would accept sacrifices in the form of gladiators who fell in the arena. The idea is that at one point, according to legend, Saturn asked for the heads of humans as sacrifices. There are no sources that mention any form of human sacrifices to Saturn or this pater. This pater is in essence Pluto, the god of the Underdark, and is in very close connection to Saturn. So as I mentioned, there are no sources that mention any kind of human sacrifices brought to Saturn or to this pater, not even in the Republican times, most definitely not in the imperial times. So this is why even for the Romans it is a very obscure and very old legend about Saturn. But they came up with workarounds because they would not sacrifice humans. As such, they would offer effigies of humans as a sacrifice. Now, a very interesting aspect of this celebration, at least in my opinion, is the reversal of roles. There are several accounts of this reversal of roles. Let me explain. During the Saturnalia, the enslaved would take the place of the enslavers and dine, be waited upon by their enslavers. If a household had enslaved people working in it, the enslavers would wait on them. They would feast at the tables and don the clothing of their enslavers. Of course, this didn't mean that they had any real power, but they enjoyed a day of no labor and of fine dining, at least in theory. Other sources mention that the enslavers would dine alongside their enslaved, and there are sources who mention that both slaves and citizens would don felt hats or felt caps called a pileatus. That was the sign of a freedman, the sign of a libertus. This made everybody equal in the streets. You couldn't tell a citizen from a freedman from a slave. And it was also a festival of free speech, and during these days, slaves were allowed to insult and to criticize their enslavers, of course, to a certain degree. It wouldn't have been wise to go around and just cuss your enslaver out, because the day and the celebration would eventually end and you would revert to your de facto position. Saturnalia was also a celebration during which gambling was allowed. For the longest of time, and I think almost throughout history, gambling was either illegal, outlawed, or it was simply frowned upon. Especially in the Roman Empire, gambling was for the longest of time a huge no-no. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it only happened behind closed doors. But during the Saturnalia, people were allowed to openly gamble. The reason behind gambling being prohibited was the belief of senators and emperors that those who congregate to drink and to gamble were also planning uprisings or revolts. As such, they tried to make sure that this didn't happen by outlawing things that might allow people to congregate in larger numbers and where spirits might get inflamed. Starting with the 19th December, gifts were exchanged. Officially, the day of gift exchanging was the 21st, but people wanted to enjoy the holiday spirits and they started 2 days earlier. There were rules in the Roman world about gifts. They tried to come up with universal gifts. We all know, we all have that friend or had that friend who couldn't really afford to buy big presents or expensive presents, and there's no problem with that, there's no shame in that. Some of us might have actually been that friend. I found myself numerous times in the position of not being able to attend the party because I was too ashamed that I couldn't afford a more expensive, more valuable gift. And of course there are those assholes who make a point of opening everybody's presents in the presence of others just to, I don't know, show off or to isolate those who couldn't afford more. Because the Romans found themselves in the same pickle, they came up with a system that actually worked. The usual gifts that were exchanged during the Saturnalia were small pottery or wax figures of deities or of mythological creatures or of fantastical characters. I am sure, although don't quote me on this, I'm sure that different craftsmen came with different interpretations of, let's say, Hercules or a very renowned gladiator of that particular period, and have them made in different positions, in different postures, with different weapons and different equipment. These might have been actually collectibles. I think especially the fantastical creatures might have been collectibles. Anyway, other gifts that were acceptable were candles, being a symbol of the returning of the light and warmth and all that thing, or most people enjoyed gag gifts. Oh, by the way, they also came with greeting cards, but we'll get to that. The ancient author Martial leaves us a list of acceptable gifts: books, masks, toys, pets, parrots, cups, plates, spoons, styluses and writing tablets, pipes, lamps, toys and balls. Catullus actually mentions that he received a book of very, very bad poetry. I like to believe that it was a collection of the cringiest wishes and messages on greeting cards. Oh, I forgot. Another acceptable gag gift were sausages. I don't mind getting sausages, they might be delicious. Okay, let's move on. Another interesting part of the Deo Saturnalia was the election of the King of Ceremony or the King of Saturnalia. This role was not mentioned during the Roman Republic, and scholars believe that it might have evolved during the Empire as a result of only one individual having the sole authority and sole power throughout the empire, the emperor. Something that at first people didn't really necessarily agree with, being used to having a senate. But the role of the king of Saturnalia was that of misruling. He was a king of chaos. All of his commands had to be obeyed, and all of his commands were silly. But I'm sure you know what I mean. We've all been to that party where after a few drinks, people with weird ideas start popping up. Like, do a handstand, drink 18 shots in a row, try to say your name backwards 18 times and if you fail, drink. Or jump naked in the pool. Do handstands in your shorts. Make the figure 8 with your butt on the door. We all know those idiotic, sometimes, challenges. The role survived throughout centuries and reached the Middle Ages, where people during the winter holidays would elect a king of misrule. Now, to wrap up Deo Saturnalia, let's talk about the actual greeting Deo Saturnalia. This was either an invocation or it was something that was said during triumph, like "Yay!" perhaps, or it was used to punctuate a joke apparently. And with that, I think it is time we talk about the miniature. But before we do so, If you've reached this far in the video and you found any kind of value in it, make sure you hit that like button. Shows me that it was actually useful. Make sure you subscribe. It helps the channel grow and it helps more people see it. And make sure you hit that bell notification that allows you to make sure you don't miss any future videos that I put out about this kind of silly nonsense. Perhaps you might find some inspiration for your world building or simply get enough trivia to bore the living shit out of those around you. And if you want to see more of my lovely assistants who are right now absent from this video, make sure you check out my lovely wife's YouTube channel, TW Creative -Cats, a channel that has nothing to do with history and has everything to do with wonderful cat adventures. Now, let's go to the mini. I've spent significant time on the cloak by now, as it is one of the more central elements of the miniature. While it is drying, I am using barbarian flesh from bones to paint the face of the miniature, the only bit of skin showing. I will use Agrag's Earthshade to add shadows to the face. Later on, using Flayed One flesh, I will add highlights to the face, and then I will go back to a darker color, Bugman's Glow, to add a little of that rosy hue, as I felt it was missing with the skin being a little too pale. Let's continue with our story. Another winter solstice celebration comes from the Persian world, from the Near East, and it is called Yalda. I hope I'm not mispronouncing it. This festivity is held in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey and other Middle Eastern countries even to this day. This is a very old celebration. It was first mentioned in a source in 502 BCE during the reign of Darius I or Darius the Great, the Persian king. This celebration marks the birth of the sun god Mithra. It is a celebration during which families come together for an overnight. Sorry, one of my assistants has decided to join me and right now she is wreaking havoc on my things around here. Hey! Oh, no. This celebration was an opportunity for families to come together for an overnight event during which people would eat nuts and fruits, especially pomegranates and watermelons. The red color of these two fruit represented the rebirth of the sun and of life and color and warmth. The idea behind an overnight gathering was the belief that the spirits of darkness were at their peak strength and people were safer in numbers. Also, if you fell asleep, bad luck would be able to find you. Now, that's a very interesting concept. In China, we have the Donzi. Again, I'm sure I'm butchering this name. Please forgive me if I'm doing so. I'm not doing it intentionally. This celebration was first mentioned at the end of the 3rd century BCE during the Han Dynasty. It was a moment when families came together from across the realm to celebrate the winter solstice. This was a moment when family ties were reforged and strengthened. People would eat sticky rice balls, or in the northern parts of China they would eat dumplings, while in the south they would eat rice cakes. The sticky nature of the balls or the dumplings or the cakes meant that families sticking together. It's a very interesting concept that revolves around very tasty food. You can't argue with that. Now let's talk about the Yule. This is one of the most famous pagan celebrations that still has an important role, especially in the northern European countries, in the Anglo-Saxon world and in the US. This celebration comes from Norse Scandinavia, from Vikings in essence. In the 10th century CE, the first king of the Vikings, the king of Norway, Hakon I, returned to his lands Christianized. Now, he needed to cater to his people as he wanted to bring them into the Christian fold. Remember that most of his people were still pagans. He moved the Yule to coincide with Christmas for it to be more easily accepted. Then he introduced the rule that everybody had to have ale during the celebration, and the celebration ended when the ale ran out. Who didn't abide by these rules would be fined. And imagine your leader coming up to you and saying you have to drink during this celebration and you will stop celebrating when the drink is over. Well, you would, I think, make sure that that drink lasts as long as possible for you to celebrate for as long as possible, regardless of what you are celebrating, or at least in theory. Once Christianized, the Norse people continued celebrating Yule but melded with Christmas and just kept on celebrating as they used to. During this celebration, a large log would be brought home and lit on one end. The celebration ended once the log burned out completely. This would usually take about 12 days, and of course people had to make sure that the log stayed lit for 12 days. Nowadays, this has survived in the form of people burning logs in their fireplace, if you have a fireplace. And I'm sure I saw some commercials regarding very interesting scented logs or logs infused with different materials so that they burn in different colors, which is quite interesting, to be fair. Or they would bring home a cake in the shape of a log. The Yule was celebrated through dance, poetry, and drinking. Very, very Viking of them. Although a very, very Viking celebration, it is a universal celebration. Because we are also talking about the longest and darkest night in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, for the Norse, there was also a very supernatural element to this night. The celebration was believed to be in connection with the wild hunt, in connection to Odin or Wotan or his wife, and in connection to the Draugr, the Norse undead. Again, being the longest night of the year, the forces of darkness were at their peak strength. I will do a future video around the wild hunt, but that's another story for another time. With that being said, let us pause and take a look at the miniature. With the crown on the miniature's head now painted with oranges and yellows, while it is drying, I will turn my attention to the last elements of the armor. As I want the armor to reflect a little bit of warmth, I am using fulgurite copper on the chainmail elements. I am also darkening these parts using Agrax Earthshade and adding shadows. I will use the same copper on the details and edges of the suit of armor. Painting the edges of the armor with copper is quite stressful, as it is the last stretch before I am done with a miniature, and any false move can ruin the armor at this point. Although covering any mistakes would not be too hard, I just want to avoid doing so. I think I'm gonna need a new very, very thin brush soon. I wonder if there's still enough time to ask Santa Claus for one. Okay, let's continue. I want to make sure that you understand that celebrating winter solstice was not something that was specific to Europe or Asia or the Near East or Africa. No, it was something, and it still is something universal. The Zuni people in North America celebrate the Shalako. Again, please forgive me if I'm butchering these names. This celebration falls on the 49th night after the 10th full moon of the year. It is celebrated with dances, prayers, and feasts. The celebration takes 4 days. The sun or the new sun is announced by the head priest with specific calls. The Hopi people in North Arizona celebrate the Soyal. Again, please forgive me. This is a festivity during which they purify themselves, they dance, they sing, they feast, and they engage in gift giving. They also welcome the guardian spirits from the mountains. The Inca celebrated the Inti Raymi. Again, I'm sorry. This was their sun god. So they celebrated their sun god. The celebration would take 9 days and it would have been conducted in the city centers. They celebrated through dancing, feasting, sacrifices, most likely human sacrifices, at least in particular moments in time, and they did so to ensure a good harvest. After their territory was conquered by the Spanish and their population decimated and enslaved, the Spanish outlawed this celebration and instead imposed Christmas. This celebration, this original celebration, was revived over the past decades, and now in certain parts it is once again celebrated alongside Christmas. And before I go and wrap things up, I want to talk about the most likely origin of Christmas, and for that we'll be talking about Sol Invictus, a celebration that took part on the 25th of December. So let's start with Dies Natalis Sol Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun. As I mentioned, this was celebrated on the 25th of December, and the first celebration was attested in 274 AD. The cult of the sun god was brought to prominence by the Roman Emperor Aurelian. There are two schools of thought regarding Sol Invictus. On one side, we have scholars who believe that Sol was a minor deity that had been present in the Roman pantheon from the earliest stages of the Roman people, while the other school of thought believes that it was a new deity brought from the eastern part of the empire with the legions and with merchants and so on and so forth, and that the two deities, although both are representative of the sun, so Sol, they were distinct. But regardless on the camp you fall in, the cult of Sol Invictus was celebrated alongside that of Mithras. And these two cults were the initial rivals of Christianity. This brings me to Mithraism, or the celebration of the god Mithras. This is the god that we mentioned before in the celebration of Yalda, and it was an Iranian or Persian sun god. He is believed, well, the story goes that on the 25th of December he was birthed from a stone, from a rock, as a teenager while holding in his right hand a dagger and in his left hand a lit torch, symbolizing the rebirth of the sun. He is depicted as slaying a sacred bull with the dagger he's holding in his right hand, while aided by a dog, a snake, a raven, and a scorpion. All the while looking back over his right shoulder to Sol, to the sun. This was a preferred deity among soldiers starting with the 1st century CE. And up until the 4th century CE, he was one of the most important deities for legionnaires. The greatest downside of this cult, the greatest flaw it had that allowed Christianity to overtake it quite quickly, was the fact that it was a cult of mysteries. There were rites of passages, there were hidden shrines throughout the empire, shrines in which a very limited number of people could attend sacrifices and ceremonies. The communities were very tightly knit and very small, which prevented actually the spread of the cult quickly. And it being a cult predominantly linked to the military, it meant that most of the followers of Mithras were men. Again, a very limiting factor. In Rome alone, there were 680 Mithrei identified, or shrines to Mithras. But such shrines. Such temples were found across the empire, from the furthest reaches of Deea to Hadrian's Wall and to northern Africa, and from east to west. This cult was very widespread, was very beloved by people. Once Christianity took over in the 4th century, the celebration of Christmas or the birth of Christ was moved from most likely the middle of the summer, as most scholars nowadays believe, to the 25th of December, in order to easily overtake and overshadow Mithraism and the celebration of Sol Invictus, and for easier conversion of those who were still pagan. By melding the two and overlapping the two celebrations, it was easier for people to not give up their celebration and their rituals and the spirit of the holidays, and instead slowly but surely accept the changes. The reason for choosing the 25th, in my opinion, were that Christ is the bringer of change, or the rebirth of nature and life, if you think about it. Again, people were easier to convert if they didn't have to make a lot of changes. Christ is the unconquerable sun to a certain degree, if you think about it, and most Christian celebrations and ceremonies and holidays overlap that of ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, again for easier conversion. And it was a good opportunity to link the birth of Christ with your Saturnalia, so it was a longer period of celebrations culminating with the birth of Christ instead of the birth of Mithras or Sol Invictus. It was a very interesting and very well thought out plan. The first Christmas in recorded history was on the 25th of December 336 CE. But at first, for the first almost half a century, 80 years, 100 years, people didn't actually want to celebrate the 25th of December. And when I say people, I mean Christians, because on the 6th of January, Christ was baptized. That was more important for them than his birth, because once baptized, that was his true birth. It's a whole religious thing. We're gonna get to it at one point, but that's another story for another time, so not now. But for the longest time, Christians did not want to celebrate 25th of December as the birth of Christ, because they considered the 6th as being the true birth of Christ. And Christmas only began being a very important Christian celebration in the 9th century, so almost 500 years later. They made sure they uproot and destroy the pagan ceremonies and installed the Christian ones, but they didn't consider this particular celebration very important until 500 years later, which is quite interesting. Oh, and let's be clear. Once Christians gained the upper hand and Christianity was the official religion of the empire, they very quickly started punishing and discriminating and purging those who didn't convert to Christianism. And this is kinda interesting because, and I don't want to get too much into religion, but Romans kinda were more tolerant of different religions as long as you paid your taxes and you didn't start any uprisings or revolt or didn't start trouble. You could follow any god you wanted, you could venerate anything you wished as long as you obeyed the imperial rules. While Christians made sure it's their way or the highway. Now, the Christmas that is nowadays celebrated has been revived in the 19th century in the Anglo-Saxon world. especially the gift exchange part. And let's be honest, that is one of the best parts of this whole period of time, the gift exchange. Then, with the help of advertisement, Christmas became one of the best known and most beloved Christian celebration. And I do hope you remember what me and those around me believe to be the best Christmas commercial ever. I hope you know what I'm talking about. It's the one with the trucks. Best commercial ever. I still remember the first time I saw it as a kid. I was enthralled. It was insane. And then I actually saw Coca-Cola trucks driving down the boulevard with the song playing, and it was insane, amazing. It was, in my opinion, a stroke of genius. It was one of the best commercials and campaigns ever. This spread the Anglo-Saxon Christmas and Santa Claus so far and wide. Oh, by the way, as far as I remember, initially Santa Claus was depicted as wearing blue, but Coca-Cola made him red, and it stuck with red. That's so interesting. Now, I think we're kind of done with Christmas and Santa Claus and Jesus and Sol Invictus and everybody else. But if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Hanukkah, it's quite simple. Hanukkah has nothing to do with Christmas or the winter solstice. Actually, Hanukkah is the celebration of the regain of Jerusalem and the rededication and reconsecration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the 3rd century BCE. Oh, sorry, the 2nd century BCE, during the Maccabean revolts against the Seleucid Empire. And although it falls in the same period as Christmas, it has nothing to do with winter solstice. And today we are talking about celebrations around the winter solstice. And with that, we will end today's episode. This will be the last episode of the year as I'm going on vacation, and I will come back with a new video after New Year's in the 2nd week of January. Oh, by the way, I think my next video will be around the New Year celebrations across the world. Yeah, that would be awesome actually. And with that, I hope you enjoy your winter celebration. I hope you gain XP after your family encounters. I hope you have a very pleasant winter solstice celebration, whatever that celebration is, and I wish you a happy new year. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Thank you so much for the support you've shown me throughout this year, and I truly hope you found some inspiration, you learned something new, and I can't wait to see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of miniature painting, history, world building, and history trivia. Remember, always stay curious and always keep on world building. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers and Happy New Year!